These guys from a podcast called This Podcast is Making Me Thirsty want to talk to you. And I think and I said, you don't have to tell me what it's about. I said, if it's called This Podcast is Making Me Thirsty, you definitely don't need to tell me what it's about. And I'm going on. This is what I want to do.
It's a Seinfeld podcast. It's called This Podcast is Making Me Thirsty. But I thought, this is what a podcast should be.
I just did the Seinfeld guys pod the other day. It came up.
These pretzels are making me thirsty.
Oh,
that one. Shout out. We've done it. I've done it. Have you did it?
I've not gotten a chance to do it yet. I'm looking forward to it.
It's so fun. They're so fun.
When I don't know, it must have shown up in my feed, but I see these guys tweeting about Seinfeld. I'm like, oh, what's this? And I find it's a podcast called This Podcast is Making Me Thirsty.
One of the most popular Seinfeld podcasts is This Podcast is Making Me Thirsty, co-hosted by Chris O'Hara and Tony Chulin.
Welcome to This Podcast is Making Me Thirsty, the number one destination for Seinfeld fans. This is episode 193. Today's guest is a legendary director, writer, and producer who started his career as a writer for the entire run of Fridays. He directed and executive produced Curb Your Enthusiasm and wrote and executive produced Entourage at times simultaneously. He directed Borat, Bruno, and the Dictator. He directed and co-wrote Masked and Anonymous with Bob Dylan. He created, directed, and executive produced Larry Charles' Dangerous World of Comedy. His new book, Comedy Samurai, 40 Years of Blood, Guts, and Laughter, is now available everywhere. And of course, he's on the Seinfeld Mount Rushmore as a producer and a writer of 18 Seinfeld episodes, including some of the most groundbreaking, innovative, genre-bending episodes of all time. We are honored to have him join us. Please welcome Larry Charles. Larry, thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Larry, here's the book, folks. The book was as relatable as it gets for any walk of life, quite frankly. And the line that hit home for me and set the tone for your career is, I'd rather fail on my feet than succeed on my knees. I mean, that one hit me, Larry, and I know that was set the tone for the rest of your career. Tell me a little bit about what you meant by that and how that kind of shaped your process and your career.
Well, first, let me say I appreciate what you're saying, but I tend not to use the word career when I describe my work, only because I had no set agenda ever, except to do cool things and hope that I could do great things, and occasionally that's worked out. So I never thought of myself as having a career. It just doesn't, I don't have like a kind of that sort of body of work, and that goes with that motto about failing on my feet rather than succeeding on my knees. Whenever I felt like I had compromised anything along the way, I would have a visceral, intuitive, instinctive feeling of nausea, of wanting to almost like kill myself for allowing myself to be talked into something that I knew was wrong. And very early on, I learned to push back against that. And often when I push back against that sort of pressure, which everybody feels in all walks of life, as you point out, you generally will relent. It's very hard to fight back against that pressure. But I learned that you can fight back if you are willing to fail, and failure is an important component of success. And I felt like I would rather fail doing it my way without compromise than succeeding in somebody else's way that I knew wasn't as good or wasn't right on some level. And so that's where all that comes from.
Yeah, and that's a hell of a motto. And to your point, I mean, it's evident in what you've done that you kind of stick to your guns. And with that, just to kind of take us back to Seinfeld, your first episode of Seinfeld that you wrote, right? You killed Jerry. Now, I just remember watching this live, and at the time we were conditioned watching television shows growing up. Okay, Three's Company, there's misunderstanding. Cheers, Diane and Sam does something wrong, and then there's just these patterns we fall into, and we start watching Seinfeld when it first airs live early on, and I was trying to figure out the pattern. Okay, am I going to watch the show? Do I like it? What's going on? And there never was a pattern. And then the baby shower airs, and I mean, mind blown, right? There's no, he's going to sleep. There's no like, he's dreaming, right? He just walks in and, okay, this is what's happening. And you don't think it's a dream until maybe when he starts getting shot. Then I'm like, okay, we got something there, right? So, I mean, take us through that. Just how you got that across to everyone in the room, how that got produced, like what what your thought process was. We're gonna shoot Jerry in a dream sequence, and we're not gonna know it's a dream until he gets shot, kind of thing, right?
Well, I mean, it's a testament to Larry and Jerry that here I was coming out of left field, kind of an outsider, and they completely supported me in these kind of ideas. All along the way, I always had their support. Nothing got on the air without them being very enthusiastic about it, and they loved that idea. Particularly Jerry. Jerry just thought it was like great to kill him right away, and so part of that came from the fact that Larry and I came from a more of a sketch tradition where death was more a part of the fabric, and we always felt like death was a part of life. So we used death for humor. We were both very into black humor, and Jerry, despite his clean cut image, he was too. And this was part of his thing, was kind of being very cool with going to these dark places. In fact, being our guide, our Rod Serling to these dark places in comedy, So I didn't like sitcoms. And I was not a sitcom fan. And so my goal was to find form and structure and style and story that would not normally be done in sitcoms, And I had this Tarantino type idea of killing him, and because of the illegal cable, and I wrote it, and it just was funny. And of course, Michael doing it, the cable boy, his little cable boy eulogy, I mean, it was like priceless. And he always brought something special to those moments, which I love. That's why I love writing for him. So I was always committed to trying to figure out a way to break the form, to expand the form, and to make it very non-sitcom-like. The whole sitcom genre did not generally excite me, even though there's a lot of good writing, good acting, and all that. I wanted to do something more intense in that format, if possible. And Jerry and Larry gave me permission to do that, and so I just went with it.
Yeah, I mean, and it wasn't just a baby shower, as you mentioned. It was pretty much every episode you did. I mean, from the statue to the subway, things going on there. All of your episodes, gritty, dark. Like you said, there's always a character involved that's going to be doing something sort of nefarious, and like you said, nothing like we saw on sitcoms before. And that's a testament, like you said, to and I guess that's kind of a question that leads into it. Is early on. You mentioned you didn't like sitcoms, and in the book you touched on that really Larry and Jerry weren't watching Cheers, they weren't watching sitcoms, and the earlier writers that were brought in, like Matt Goldman and these guys, they weren't sitcom writers either. So it's almost like, to your point, and maybe you could just expand on this, not having experience, right, was a blessing in a way, right? It was like, oh, we have no rules, so we're going to make our own rules.
Right.
That's sort of how you looked at it.
That's part of it. Also, another part of it goes back to what we were talking about, failing on our feet. When Larry asked me to work on the show, what he said to me was, "Well, we'll do 13 episodes. It'll be canceled. We'll make a little bit of money, and then we'll just kind of go on our way." And so we were sort of expecting to fail, and our attitude was, "Let's just make a show that we find funny. Let's just do what pleases us, because we know we're not going to make it. Let's go down with the ship, and we'll be cool about that. And at least we can hold our head up high as we sink under the water." And that was part of the boldness, the audacity of the show. Was we expected to fail, and then we didn't, and there we were, and the audience started to respond to that stuff, which was amazingly ironic and very confusing for the network as well.
For sure. And Larry, Tony just touched on this. He mentioned the subway and, the structure of Seinfeld. Historically, we talked to a ton of writers, and it came from stories from their own experience. And I know, obviously, the subway was an experience your father went through. And you talk about your father a lot in the book, to various degrees, right? Regrets, instincts, and would love to hear a little bit. And suppose that you wrote he didn't even watch the subway episode, but Was that the only episode that it sounds like most of the other, the 18, they're all classics, but were those from your experiences or were those just ideas? I mean,
it was both. I mean, I think that, a lot of things come from your own personal experience, but Larry and Jerry, particularly Larry, he had so many experiences that were, the show is very autobiographical for him, and for me, some of it was autobiographical. A lot of things came from my life or stories that I heard, but I also was, and this is true of all shows really in a way, we were scrambling to come up with ideas and stories. And so if I had a thread of a story, like my father having been on the subway, falling asleep on the subway and waking up and there was a naked man sitting next to him, that got me thinking about an episode based on the subway, and then thinking about my own experiences on the subway, things that I had thought about, things that I watched happen, like Kramer trying to get that seat. I mean, he turned it into a beautiful ballet of sorts, but we've all had that experience of, if you've ridden the subway in New York, of trying to find a seat in rush hour, and everybody just, it's just like animalistic, just grabbing for anything they can get. So each little section was stuff that I started to put together from my own experiences of having ridden the subway from the last stop in Brooklyn into Manhattan so many thousands of times in my life, and having, all those kind of experiences, from the blind man walking through and I used to be amazed that the blind man would walk through the subway car and not fall down, because it was hard to keep your balance, How did he know where the door was? How did he know where the pole was? So all that stuff I would just accumulate, and then I was able to kind of structure it into, then I thought, wow, I've never seen this done before, a whole story that basically takes off from a subway ride. So it's a combination of me looking for new form and new structure and taking story threads that I had and trying to put it together. It's not dissimilar, actually, from the way Bob Dylan works, where he will take many different threads of lines from different places that he's had over the years and put those together into a song. And it's kind of like a William Burroughs cut-up technique, if you're familiar with that. A lot of the stuff that William Burroughs wrote for a certain period of his career was cut up, pieces, and he put those texts together, and those juxtapositions would form the content. And that's sort of what I was trying to do in this sitcom format.
Yeah, and you did successfully. As O'Hara mentioned, I mean, your episodes are all classics. I mean, you brought up Dylan, so we'll just jump right in. I mean, I'm a huge Dylan guy, so reading that part of the book really just blew me away. Especially, I mean, I don't even know where to start, but I guess what I'll start with is the box. Like, so I rewatching the movie again, just to be, before we talk to you, I wanted to make sure I rewatched it, and I know you said this, I believe you said this, you could say it again now if it's true, but I'm pretty sure you said you wanted to try and make the movie like it was about Dylan's song. And
Yes.
In the CD liner notes, the guy who wrote the CD liner notes actually said it did seem like that. And that's exactly the image I got. It's like a 90-minute version of Desolation Row, or of it's only, Mom Only Bleeding. But how did that, how much of that was you? How much of that was Bob? And like, how did this box come into play? I mean, he just dumped a box out, and you had to piece this together. Or was it like? I guess you could talk to just the writing process with Bob. I guess is what I'm kind of most.
Well, there were a number of agendas at work. Not that we really were that conscious of it, but we didn't really have like a goal in mind so much. I mean, it started off being this comedy, this half-hour comedy that he had wanted to do, from having ridden on the bus for so long on the Never-Ending Tour, and having a VCR up on the bus and getting into these Jerry Lewis movies. He just got it in his mind, and this is the way his mind works. He was like, I'd like to do a comedy show. So that's how they got in touch with me, and I met with him. And we really, I won't go into the whole long story of how our first meeting, but very quickly at that first meeting, we started working, and we just started exchanging ideas. And then when I went to start meeting him on a regular basis behind the coffee house in this boxing gym, in this cubicle, we would sit in this cubicle like two caged animals. We'd never leave the cubicle 12 hours. He wouldn't ask me if I wanted something to drink. Did I need anything to eat? Nothing. We would just keep going. And he would be smoking, chain smoking the whole time, so that the square was just like filled with smoke. And we would just start writing. And the first thing he did was he brought out this beautiful embossed box, this rectangular box, and opened it and dumped it out on the desk. And it was all filled with scrap paper, like hotel stationery, little scraps of paper from all over the world. And they had little handwritten notes on them, almost like fortune cookies that he had handwritten. And on those were, something like Uncle Sweetheart. And I would say, well, this could be the name of a character. And then there would be like a cool line about something. And I would go, well, this could be a line of dialogue that he could say. And he would say, you could do that? And I would go, yeah, why not? Why can't we do it? And I realized that is the way he would write a song. But, applying it to this form, he hadn't done that before. So we just started. So when you ask, what was Bob, what was me? I mean, everything is Bob in a sense when you work with Bob,
Right. Right.
But one thing I did, and I did this on Seinfeld too, and I've done this in my career, is I sort of do what I call channeling. We know channeling when you're kind of like bringing a soul out from, you're getting a soul from the ether and you're bringing it out and you're embodying that soul. I learned how to channel like Larry or Bob, and so I could write really in Bob's voice, and keep it consistent with what he was writing, because he would have a piece, he would have a monologue, a brilliant monologue, unbelievable, that could stand on its own like a poem, but there was no scene. So I would have to write the scene and the other characters' voices and the other characters' dialogue and what would happen next. And so that structure, the rest of that dialogue would often be on me. So there was like kind of a very seamless flow that we had in that collaboration. And again, as I often think about, I still can't believe that happened. That I sat across from Bob, that I made this movie, that I directed him, that we became close for a while, which again, unusual. He has very few collaborators, as you know, in his life, who've, maybe they've written a song together or a couple of songs, but to write a script and then make a movie together, that was a major collaboration. And I feel incredibly blessed and lucky to have that experience.
Yeah, it looks like your first meeting, he stole your coffee, as I recall in the book, right?
Yes.
But some of the best advice that he gave you, according to the book, was just trust your instinct, right? And I think that's something that you definitely carried on. I'm not going to say career, Larry, but throughout your life.
Well, both he and Larry both had that philosophy of trust your instincts, because that's all you got. You're going to get a lot of advice, you're going to get a lot of outside input, but you have to trust your instincts, and your instincts can be wrong. They're not infallible. Nobody's infallible, but it's all you have really are your instincts. And he certainly has trusted his, and he's Bob Dylan. So, it's hard to argue with that logic coming from him.
His pen was sweat and blood. It needed to be as a human. Val Kilmer's scene that comes to mind when you mentioned like dialogue. I'm sure it must have been. And just one more thing on that too. Just speaking of, you just kind of mentioned the songs. I mean, I was just showing you the soundtrack. I mean, how deep did you go into Bob Dylan covers? I mean, there's some, obviously you've heard the Dead one. I've heard a bunch, and Garcia and maybe Los Lobos, but you have Japanese covers, you have Italian covers. I mean, the breadth of this, it must have been kind of take me through your process there and how you even came up with the songs on this.
Well, I had the idea of using covers as kind of the soundtrack. Besides the music he would record live, I didn't want to, and he didn't really want to use any of his music, his actual singing, his Bob Dylan singing music in the soundtrack. But I had certain covers already in my mind that I loved. And so I asked Jeff Rosen, and Jeff Rosen made me at the time a CD or a couple of CDs of covers of Bob Dylan songs from all over the world.
Right.
And then in the editing process, I was able to mix and match and try different things. And there was so much more that I wanted to use. And again, we also recorded about 22 songs with Bob and that band, which was a great band. And so there's only 11 songs, I think, in the movie. So that stuff is all unreleased as well, and that's really tight, fantastic Bob Dylan music as well. And there's just tons of great covers from all over the world, and continue to be actually.
Yeah, it's incredible. The movie's very. I don't know if this was purposeful. I know you mentioned it a few times in the book that you were fans of the Coen brothers, but I thought the movie had a little Coen brothers esque to it, just the way you shot it, and then the way the music is weaved in and out throughout. It definitely shows that.
Well, don't forget John Goodman and Jeff Bridges also.
That doesn't hurt, right? Exactly. But the cast is incredible too. I mean, like you mentioned, I saw you mention once that Dylan was kind of the casting director, if you will. But I mean, you brought in guys to do bit parts that were major players. Val Kilmer, Ed Harris. I mean, they didn't have major roles, but just incredible stuff.
Bob was the lore. You say you're making a Bob Dylan movie, people just turned out. I mean, Luke Wilson was the first person to say, I'll do anything in the movie. And then from there, everybody just sort of fell into place. Jeff Bridges amazingly said no. The first time we showed the script to him, he actually turned it down. And then he had, again, there was so many serendipitous moments. He called me out of the blue a few weeks later and said, hey, I've been thinking about it. Why don't you come up to my house and we'll talk about the movie, And I rolled up a couple of joints because it's like I'm going to see the Big Lebowski, and I'm going to see Jeff. I'm actually going to go hang out with him, and I drove up there like a maniac from Los Angeles. I drove up to Santa Barbara, and we hung out for the day. Of course, he's got ashtrays all over the house, everywhere, outside, and they were all empty. So I didn't feel right going, hey, you want to smoke? Because maybe he doesn't really smoke in real life, It's the dude, but maybe that was just a part, So I didn't want to make assumptions about that. But we hung out all day. We talked about the movie. He played music for me. We did a lot of just good hanging out type of stuff. And by the end of that day, he had committed to the movie and wound up being a crucial component of the movie, not just for his own performance, but in the way that he actually helped Bob with his performance, because Jeff Bridges is the most knowledgeable person on a movie set that I've ever met, because he's been doing it since he's 4 years old, when he would visit his father on Sea Hunt. When his father, Lloyd Bridges, was on that show, Sea Hunt, he was around. He knows lighting. He knows gaffing. He knows the cameras. He knows everything. And so I relied on him also. That was my first movie. I'd only directed one Curb episode before I was thrust into that movie. So, he was great. And yeah, all the actors in that completely were devoted to Bob and prepared to do anything. And they did.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I learned a ton in this book just about the industry that I never did, especially on this movie, right? I think they limited you to 110 minutes, and everyone you worked with, from Sasha to Larry, and then, we could even tie it back to Seinfeld, kind of put constraints on things. And that's tough to do with someone that has a creative mind, right? So, and we talked with Matt Goldman early on, and you referenced this in the book, but it was actually before you came. He said Jerry was the one that went in and fought back against the executives, NBC, and said, listen, this is what we're going to do. If you don't like it, I'm gone. I'm happy to just stand up. And then, when you came along and you were sitting on these meetings, it sounds like Jerry kind of took the back seat, and you and Larry kind of went at it with the executives, kind of fighting tooth and nail on what you thought should be brought to the to prime time here. So it's just fascinating that and you were young. You're pretty much a young guy back then with all these suits at Castle Rock, and I guess you kind of cut your teeth a little bit. But it sounds like this went on for years and years with these executives, right?
Well, I didn't know any better, really. I was used to, I had done Fridays, and on Fridays you argued for your piece, and you fought tooth and nail. And again, Larry was my mentor right from the beginning, and he never backed down on anything. And we were from Brooklyn besides it. So, there was a kind of Brooklyn, kind of bluster about us that we would not back down. But we believed in what we were doing, whereas the executives were sort of wanting us to sort of follow the rules and be traditional. And I think I think when Matt was talking about that version of the show was the early nascent embryonic version of the show. If it had remained that way, I don't think it would have been the hit that it became. What happened was it had a massive evolution during those first 13 episodes. And it went from being kind of like almost traditional, Kramer coming in as a next door neighbor and just doing a little bit and leaving. Elaine not really having all that much to do. It was really about Jerry and George, which was classic stuff. And those are great episodes. But if it had stayed in that little bubble, I don't think it would have exploded out for an audience. And so the show was kind of went through this forced evolution that kind of expanded the palette of what a Seinfeld episode could be. We were looking to crack the code. It was like a laboratory, What can we do? How far can we go? How can we expand upon this so that it's great? Because again, we were thinking, well, it's going to get canceled anyway. Let's experiment and see what we could do. And my experiments, again, as I said, were supported by Larry and Jerry, and even things like the Chinese restaurant. I mean, to me, that's one of the most brilliant episodes because it's like a Beckett play, only, waiting for a table instead of waiting for Godot, And I think we were like blowing the network's minds with these kind of episodes. And they didn't know what to do. They were like, they wanted us to pull back and make it look like everything else. And we didn't know how to do that. And so we kept pushing in the other direction.
Yeah,
it was very impudent of me to argue the way I did. I mean, Larry would argue with them, but I would sit behind him in every meeting and I would argue vociferously. And later on, I think I talk about it in the book, like, what was I thinking? I mean, they could have just fired me right then and there, and it wouldn't have been the wrong thing to do, really, But I felt like I'm going down with the ship. I've always felt that. If I'm here, the comedy samurai, if I'm here, I'm going to save the village, or I'm going to get killed doing it, And I really did believe that, as kind of delusional as that might have been.
Yeah, I mean that's the driving force, and you mentioned the sort of the stages there, the embryonic with the Goldman and that kind of first couple of episodes. We kind of look at it. Oh, we've always looked at Seinfeld as a few different eras, right? So there's seasons 2 through 5, which for our money, the show could have ended after season 5, would have been the greatest show of all time, right? So, and in large part due to you. So that's 2 through 5, right? Which is everything you just talked about. The genre breaking and groundbreaking and not like any other sitcom. And then you and Tom Sharonis both depart after season 5, and we have 6 and 7 with Larry David still there, but a big hole missing with you and Sharonis, where the episodes don't have that kind of grit anymore, but they still have Larry David and there's still something there. And then after Larry leaves, obviously after 7, it to each their own, not our cup of tea, but it gets a little bit more campy, a little bit more absurd and cartoonish. Question here is, season 5, you and Sharonis leave. Was that, to take a line from your statue, was that a big coincidence or a small coincidence that you and Tom both left at the same time? And sort of, did you sort of see the writing on the wall, or was it just as you put in the book, you wanted to do more, you wanted to direct, and it was just your time? Or maybe take us through the thought process there of your departure, and maybe in Tom's, if you had any inkling on him as well.
I think it's funny. I didn't even realize until people started saying this to me that Tom Sharonis left when I left. I didn't pay any attention to that, and it really had nothing to do with me leaving at all. I didn't. Tom Sharonis had a very, very different role on the show. There were many discussions about replacing him. He was very much like a famous episode of mine that was pulled, the bet about Elaine buying a gun. He was like, this isn't funny. He didn't really have a great opinion about what was funny. He wasn't really there to judge the comedy. He was there to basically, cover the action as best he could, And there were times when there were efforts to replace him. We tried David Steinberg. Jason Alexander directed an episode. Joshua White, who was a friend of Larry's, directed an episode. And in the back of my mind, I thought, this is when I should really volunteer to direct an episode. But I didn't do that. And the writing was so burdensome that there would be no time to do that. So when he left, it didn't have any real impact on me whatsoever. I wasn't even conscious of that, really, For me, I left because I had reached the point where I had hit I was like, again, the George Harrison in my delusional mind. I was the George Harrison working with John and Paul, and I was never going to get more than one song on the album. And so, I felt like, wow, I have so much more I want to do. That's not a George story. That's not a Seinfeld story. When am I going to do that? It's time for me to make my move. And so it was my decision was purely a creative decision. I had just hit the wall creatively with that show. I felt like I gave it all I had. I did everything I could. The show was a big hit. The code had been cracked, and they really didn't need me anymore. And I didn't need to be there anymore. And I never went into show business for security. It's like I went into show business to do cool things, and I wasn't worried, even though I could possibly be out of work, and that could have been the end of my career, so to speak, my career. It could have easily been that, but I felt like I'm willing to take that risk and roll that dice and gamble on what might come next. What's my next challenge? What's the next village that needs saving? So that's where I was coming from. I don't know where Tom was coming from. I don't know what his decision making was at all. I couldn't say.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of the villages you did save as that samurai, be it Entourage, be it Mad About You for sure. But you talked about the bet. I just got to ask you. Hirschfeld told us that you drew a sketch of what Mo would look like. Did you have that anywhere still?
I sure I do. I mean, my house in Malibu, I've been living the last 10 years with my wife, burned down during the fires. And but in 2018, we've been evacuated a few times. So in 2018, we had to evacuate for like 2 weeks. And when our house survived that fire, we came home and I took all the stuff that I had, all the memorabilia, the Seinfeld stuff, the Bob Dylan stuff, everything that I had accumulated up to 2018, and I put it in a vault. So if I have all of my original Seinfeld scripts, all of those things are in a vault somewhere very safe. Everything that I lost was from 2018 to the present. So yeah, that everything like that is kind of put somewhere. I often drew because I started off like really wanting to be a cartoonist. So I often drew versions of characters. I drew a very famous picture of Jerry on the whiteboard in Jerry and Larry's office because George Shapiro, his manager, would always say, Jerry's got to smell like a rose at the end of the show. So I drew a picture of Jerry, a caricature, and said, smelling like a rose, and that was there for a long time also. So I often would draw to illustrate my point.
Incredible. And just one more thing, because it's a lot in the book. You talk about it, always wanted to be director. Like, what is it being a director versus a lot of the guest actors we talked to? They always thought Larry David was a director. He's a showrunner.
He really was.
Right. So maybe just tell us the differentiation between showrunner, director, producer. Obviously, right? It sounds like you were really involved in everything from casting to the table reads, everything as well, because it was kind of like, as Jerry always said, a homemade show. And maybe that wasn't the case on other sitcoms, but for Seinfeld, it seemed like it was. But I guess the director is the ultimate gig, right?
Well, not on a sitcom. Not on a sitcom. On a sitcom, you are not really as involved in the creative process. You're out on the stage, and the creative process is really taking place back in the offices. The showrunner is really the auteur of a sitcom, and that's what Larry David was. Larry David was generating ideas. He was approving other people's ideas like mine. He was helping form those ideas, and I was there for all of that. I mean, every casting session, while I worked on the show, I was at every casting session and every editing session. So I was always there as a sounding board for Larry. Plus, when he was breaking stories, he would often step out of his office, come into my office, and we would talk, or I would go into their office and talk about the stories also. So the showrunner was really involved with the creative vision of the show, whereas the director was trying to make sure that all the action was covered. He didn't have any say about the script, at least on our show. He had no say about the script, about performances, about any of that sort of stuff. That was really on Larry. And I would stand behind Larry at the rehearsals and go, we should get a close-up, because Larry was not very visually oriented. And I would go, Julia should get a close-up right there for that line, or the camera should swing, that kind of stuff. And so we were doing a lot of that, and he was really in charge of what you see in terms of a Seinfeld episode, So the showrunner is really the auteur of a show for the most part. Later on, like on things like Curb, there's a little more directing involved. There's a little bit more trying to get performances, trying to squeeze the gold, excavate the gold that sometimes is under the surface because it is improvised so much. So there was a little more to it than that on that TV show. But on most scripted TV shows, the director is there unless he's creating a new visual form like Tommy Schlamme did on West Wing and Newsroom and the shows that he did. He also directed Mad About You and did a lot of that formative stuff on Mad About You also. If you're not doing that, if you're just having 4 cameras covering the action, you're just kind of making sure that you're getting all the action on camera, He's not involved even with the editing in that respect either. So that's something that's really that's all Larry, really, to a large degree. And the actors themselves, by the way, that's one of the reasons Tom was there so long and the other directors didn't work out, was because they were also just able to work out their own business.
Right.
They were able to sort of direct themselves and help each other, and that kind of helping each other created those performances also.
That makes sense. The familiarity and the shorthand probably too. You kind of touched on some stuff there around running a show or at least being more the creative mind rather than just writing. Right, you're involved in all sorts of things, casting, things like this. One of those villages you saved, as you put it, as a samurai, what was Entourage, which if you look at it on the surface. It's very different from Seinfeld, right? It's on HBO. It's these young guys. But if you dig a little deeper, there is some parallels there, right? There's loyalty. I want to ask you this. I got the sense from the book because I was wondering how you were able to just tap into those guys because there wasn't really your world per se. I would assume, right? They were a different generation. They were kind of doing different things, I would guess. But you were able to really, come up with some great creative choices for them. Was it their outsiderness that you kind of touched in with, that they were kind of the outsiders from New York in Hollywood? And was their loyalty, because that's kind of from Seinfeld as well? It's just interesting how you were able to kind of dive into a completely different world and make your mark on it. I was curious kind of your thought process when you got into Entourage.
Well, it's interesting. When I read the script and I saw like their first attempt at the pilot, I immediately again talk about instinct. I said, this is great. This is great because it's honest and it's fresh and it's like nothing else I had seen. I related to it on all the levels you just mentioned, Tony. I mean, I was an outsider. I was from Brooklyn. In Brooklyn, like these guys, you express your love through insults. You insult each other, and that's how you express your loyalty and your friendship and your love for each other. And that's how I grew up. Everybody was cutting each other all the time, like the worst horrible things that, if they were said out loud, people would be absolutely horrified in regular life. They had brought that language, which I really responded to the language. They brought that language to Entourage. And Doug Ellen really knew how to write that language, the language of love disguised as hate in a way, So I love that aspect of it. I also, although I was of a different generation by the time I did that show, I was a young guy in Hollywood, running around, bumming around, trying to figure things out. I had comedian friends and writer friends, and they were like little groups of little cliques that I hung around with, and they were on the outskirts. And on Entourage, one of those guys gets in, and I knew from like talking to them that Mark Wahlberg's Entourage was actually Entourage. Turtle and Drama and E, those were all real people, which appealed to me also. I love the idea that there was actually real people these were based on, So it's funny, HBO had doubts about it. They were not convinced that this show is going to work. And you could see why. It was very different than everything else they were doing at that time, even though that was a golden era, and Entourage wound up being part of that golden era. they didn't see it as being part of that fabric of what they were doing at HBO at that time. But they said to me, if you work on the show, you know, you reshoot some of the pilots and you work on the show, we'll pick it up, you know. And I thought, yes, I will do that. And remember, at that time, Curb would, you know, Larry would take a couple of years off between seasons of Curb. So, you know, everybody was out of work. And here I was with an opportunity to do a cool show. And so I thought I could actually I know what this show needs to be a hit. You know, it's right on the cusp. In fact, I think I've told the story, and maybe it's even in the book, of the fact that they were not convinced Jeremy Piven should even be in the show. You know, he wasn't in the original poster, for instance. They didn't want to focus on him. And I was like, he is a breakout character. Come on. And and eventually, of course, that turned out to be true. And finding a way to kind of blur that line between real people and the fictional characters, that was a great fun and challenge of that show. So there was a lot of stuff that I related to on that show. And again, I was able to channel that language because I knew I had inherently in me that language I had grown up with.
Incredible. And Larry, I'm looking at the back cover and you mentioning Piven, it just brought back a memory. He did this to me at a Giant Stadium NFL box. He came out, I went in, and the girls behind me thought it was me the whole time. So
Yeah. We've all had that experience. Sometimes we're guilty, but sometimes we're not.
Exactly. So in the book, you talk a lot about, you know, being dark, being from Brooklyn, not having that money, that sensibility. Then the Harvard guys came in, right? I don't know. What is it about comedy? To me, is about relatability. I'll give you an example. Like, I think about Howard Stern, right? Once he got divorced and he became rich, he's always with all these women. To me, he lost it. Like, I couldn't relate to him anymore. Similarly to Seinfeld to some degree. It's funny how Curb worked, right? It's essentially following the life of a billionaire, right? But that worked. So how did that work? But you talk about in other situations, I guess money and relatability, it didn't. I'm not sure what my question is there, but it's kind of a.
I hear what you're saying, and there are a lot of contradictions and dichotomies in that equation. I think, you know, I think on Seinfeld, one of the things that appealed to me was that they were of this lower economic class. They were struggling, you know, they were struggling. How are they? Not Jerry. Jerry, even as a struggling comedian on the show, you could tell he was more successful. You know, he had the air of success. But George, how's George going to pay the rent? He was like, you know, trying to be a bra salesman, which was true of Larry. You know, he was looking for any work at all. Julia, Elaine, she couldn't hold on to a job either. She was like trying to get into publishing. Her dad was a kind of celebrated but not successful novelist. And again, even we could get into like casting, you know, Lawrence Tierney in that role, because that's also part of the formula that really exploded for Seinfeld, was casting people who were not necessarily comedy actors in these roles and giving them a certain gravitas. But there was and Kramer, how did Kramer earn a living? You know, how did he get by and pay the rent on that apartment? So those questions were really interesting to me, because that's most of my adult life up until that time was about that struggle also. How the hell, you know, I would get temp jobs, and I was a parking valet, and I was a bellhop, and I had all those kind of crappy menial jobs, and like very Bukowski-like, and thought, well, this is what I'm going to do in my life unless I make it, whatever that meant, you know. The show did change at a certain point when they started bringing in a writing staff who came, you know, inevitably from better backgrounds, intact families, you know, better education, you know, more affluence. And so then the show started to reflect that, and I started to relate to that a little bit less also. Curb is a kind of an anomaly, because you know going into Curb that Larry David is a very, very wealthy man. But what worked about Curb was that he didn't live a life of wealth, really. He lived a life besieged by life itself. And I compare it a lot to W.C. Fields, actually, who was a kind of great misanthrope and constantly complaining under his breath, and saying rude things, and people love that because it's honest. And Curb had a certain honesty. He was voicing things, and maybe people felt, well, it's because he's rich that he can, but it was very cathartic to have Larry saying things that other people were afraid to say. And maybe he was able to say it. He only had the courage to say it because he knew he had the money and didn't have to worry about the consequences so much, although he does worry about that. So in a way, his honesty and his attitude, like W.C. Fields, and that's one of the reasons, by the way, I think W.C. Fields still is funny today. If you watch The Bank Dick or any of his great movies, you will still laugh because it's his attitude that's funny. It's not the jokes. Jokes get old. Larry wasn't into jokes. He was never into jokes. He wanted to know what would really happen in this situation. That's what's funny, and that's what he did on Curb, and that's what W.C. Fields did, as opposed to, say, the Marx Brothers, who were great and I loved as a kid, but now their stuff is very joke-oriented and a little corny. W.C. Fields remains a very modern comedian because of that attitude, and I think Larry David sort of inherited that mantle.
An interesting take, and that's one of the things that's also with Seinfeld is the timelessness of it, that it holds up, and I think it holds up because of what you just talked about, that the jokes aren't in the one-liners like most sitcoms set up, punchline joke, haha, right? They were more in the interpersonal relationships and stories and what happens and that sort of thing, and relatability. And you also touched on something about Larry where you said he'll say what people don't want to say. Who else did that? Was Kramer. And for my book, and you mentioned in the book, you touched on it anyway, you pretty much created Kramer. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the stories you wrote for Kramer, starting with the statue, which is his breakout episode by far, right? He comes in the whole Joe Dragnet, Big Walter the Love Pervert, the whole thing. I mean, that, again, when I talk about mind-blowing episodes, I brought up the baby shower earlier. The statue's another one. This is early on. You don't see things like that on sitcoms where Kramer just comes in, like the whole, like, you kind of broke him out of that, and you went with it in all your episodes, really, the Pinky Toe story. I mean, the list goes on and on. But I was going to say, was he the one you liked writing for the most? But then you turn around and write things for George and Jerry in the limo, where they're, I always say the show is about perpetual adolescence, right? They never grow up. George and Jerry are just two kids in the back of the limo. Oh my God. Or in the back of the police car in the trip, right? And they're doing the siren thing. They're just kids. They're just little kids, innocent little kids. Yeah. But then you got Kramer, darkness, and all these seedy characters, the Tor Ekman and these kind of guys. You married them so well, I guess. I don't know if there's a question there, but how did you manage to do that? You wrote both of them so well.
I think with Kramer, I was very lucky, and I can't take credit for creating Kramer. I appreciate that, but I would say I had a big impact on that character and on the show by the same token, because by expanding who Kramer was and what he was capable of, it also expanded the parameters of the show as well. Kramer, as we know, Kramer was a real person who lived next door to Larry, who in his own right was a very eccentric guy. He was a former comedian. He was a guy that was constantly coming up with the story of the levels. That's a real bet that Larry and Kramer had, So he was like an eccentric guy, but he was very much like in his apartment. He was kind of agoraphobic, you might even say. So you take that element and then you add Michael Richards to it. Michael Richards with this ferocity and this physical ability that was far beyond anything that you had seen in a sitcom, And then you add my sort of underground sensibility to that, and so those ingredients made Kramer this character that he became, And once I was able to do that with the statue and these other episodes, the baby shower, etc., the trip, of course, it really allowed other people to start writing for him in that way as well. They saw there was no limits to what Kramer could do. He could be anything, really, because that was the reality of Kramer, and kind of made him a larger than life character in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and he touched everyone. I mean, I talk about a lot. My 90-year-old grandmother from Ireland, her favorite character was Kramer. He had that ability. So hats off there.
Well, let me say one more thing, if I may, which is that based on what you said about your grandma, I have traveled around the world. I really have at this point. I haven't been everywhere, but I've been to a lot of places. And wherever I go, even Islamic countries, people will come up to me and go, "My friend's just like Kramer,"
Yeah.
And so that is the universality of that character. Is that everybody knows a George, everybody knows a Kramer. It's an amazing phenomenon and quite accidental. I mean, again, we didn't set out to create these universal archetypes, but they just emerged quite organically, which is one of the reasons I think people do connect to them.
Yeah, you're quoted in the book. Seinfeld transcends language, religion, and ethnicity, like no other show, right?
I agree. I think that's really true. Yes,
And
I believe that, and I've seen the evidence of it by traveling.
yeah, of course. I mean, look, the George Costanza bobblehead at Yankee Stadium's it's selling out higher than a regular ticket. It's unbelievable. 30 years later, it's
Yeah,
unbelievable.
that's amazing. That is amazing. I know. I saw that. I couldn't believe it, but it's pleasing to know that people still feel that way about something like that.
So Larry, seasons 8 and 9, quite frankly, like Tony mentioned, I think when you left, they could have ended the show there. I would have been happy. The finale is a polarizing episode. Would love to hear your thoughts. And it looks like was there any opportunity for you to? I know Larry came back to write that. Was there any talk back then about you getting involved to help with the finale?
I came around, I was there, not during the writing so much. I can't really remember if I was around for any of the writing. I don't think I was really. I was kind of busy doing other stuff. But I was there that night when they shot it. And, the way I feel about it is that those last couple of seasons, particularly the ones without Larry, the show, when I was there and when Larry was first really starting the show and launching the show, it was like as strange and as weird and as surreal as it was an internally driven show. It was really coming out of these characters' desires and cravings and yearnings and ambitions, and there was something very organic about that internal drive that pushed everything forward. At a certain point in those last couple of years, I felt like it got mathematical, like it got external, like they were building the stories from the outside, like creating plots and being able to plug the characters into it instead of the characters driving or creating those plot stories. And I think that is what the difference is. There's a kind of there's a mathematical equation to a lot of those last episodes because things kind of fit together nicely, but they don't have that same inspiration, that same anarchic quality that those original shows had. And I think that was the difference. On the surface, for a lot of people, you guys are, experts at this, but for a lot of people, it didn't really make a difference. They wanted to see those characters every week, and they were happy to see them in any form it took. But in terms of where those stories came from, where those characters came from, that's what changed. They were now kind of like, they were sort of characters or players on a board, being moved around rather than them driving things for themselves. And that's what I think sort of changed about it. And it lost, I think it lost a little bit of its soul as a result of that, but it still it resembled Seinfeld. And that's one of the reasons I left. Once we cracked the code and we were able, I didn't want to just replicate that over and over and over again. I wanted to try something different.
That is probably the best description I've heard of the later seasons. You hit the nail right on the head. I mean, that's exactly how it was. Very, like you said, mechanical and plot driven. It was like, let's have a story. I always say there's great premises in seasons 8 and 9, but then there's just just rehashing a premise over and over. It's very, very well articulated.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. But so what I was gonna, just kind of touching back on, you mentioned how the earlier seasons were character driven. A question around this I've always wondered is Crazy Joe Devola. It seems like he's your character. I mean, the opera is hands down. Fear is our most primal emotion. And, I like to encourage intruders. The whole thing there. But he comes before that in the episode. The pitch. So did you create the character for the pitch and then kind of run with it, or was he already kind of fleshed out? Like, how did Crazy Joe Devola come about? I know you worked with Peter Crombie later on with The Middleman. I mean, he's your character like to a T. I mean, you writing him in the opera is incredible. Just curious how that came about.
Well, I think I think I'm trying to remember how I certainly did not create that character. I mean, the pitch. I think that was based loosely on another guy that Larry knew, and then he used the name Joe Devola. Joe Devola was a TV executive, a very nice guy, nothing like the character whatsoever, and often that was the case. Larry liked to use people's names if he liked their names, even if they didn't resemble the character at all. Um, so we all used, people that we knew. Bob Sacamano was a friend of mine, So they all were like real names, but they were not the people that they were portrayed on the show, of course. So I think he knew somebody who was a little off the beaten track, a little, sort of unmoored, as Joe Devola in the pitch, and then that to me was again my invitation to run with that character, and I immediately thought about again a very non-sitcom premise. He's stalking Elaine, that is not a sitcom premise, that was something that again was very very dark, and she came into his apartment, and he's got all the pictures on the wall, and he has that great scene with Kramer outside about when he's dressed as the clown. Are you afraid of clowns? So it gave me it was like an impetus for me to sort of take it one step further. And then you had Peter, who was great, playing that kind of very dry, menacing, ominous character. And again, so all those things just sort of came together, and it worked.
Yeah, I'm a day person. So speaking of Pagliacci, I'm skipping ahead to your YouTube channel, and for those who don't subscribe, it's a great place. Larry Charles Projects, and you talk about in the book your friend Adam Leslie, and I watched it. Man, tough watch, but great watch. It's funny. Two things from that. First off, he said he roomed with Sandy Barron.
Yes,
is that true?
Yes.
And then, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And then at the end, I could swear you had Pagliacci opera in there.
Yes, because Pagliacci is the clown that cries, and Adam Leslie was. I thought about Pagliacci obviously in the opera. It seemed perfect for the opera episode. But when I saw that footage in the dressing room, when I look back on it, and I was editing and trying to figure out the music, Pagliacci came to mind. The clown that cried. It gave it. He was like a tragedy. Adam was like a tragedy in the making, and Pagliacci is that ultimate tragedy opera. So it just, the clown that cries is such a powerful figure. Such resonance that I thought it gave Adam the proper weight that his life deserved, his tragedy deserved.
Yeah, and take just to touch on that your YouTube. I know you also put Army of One up there as well, and man, Nick Cage, that must have been a trip working with him in that movie. I mean, that's a performance, and just the way you again your music. I touched on a Mess and Anonymous, but the music in Army of One also kind of drives the movie really well. And I know you were very happy to kind of get that on your YouTube channel. Out of the hands of the suits or what have you. But yeah, I mean, just an incredible performance by Nick Cage. Just working with him must have been a trip.
Nick is the kind of guy, as I got to realize and learn, who he's a samurai in his own way as well. I mean, he kind of moves from project to project. When Nick Cage attaches to a project, it becomes real, and so he's really able to do that. And for me, what I learned about Nick is he devotes himself to the director's vision, and when I sat with him in the steakhouse in Las Vegas and told him the story, he was in, and once he's in, once he commits, he's immersed, on every level. And it was a joy to work with him. I had the greatest time. I hope I get an opportunity to work with him again. Maybe I will. There's a couple of projects coming up that maybe we'll get a chance to work again. And he's had disappointments. And the Army of One that was released, which was so bastardized and maimed and mangled from the version that I wanted, that really hurt him and disappointed him because he put his all into that. But he puts his all into everything, and occasionally that's what happens. A producer takes it out of the director's hand. It happened with a Paul Schrader movie called Dog Eat Dog, or maybe, yeah, I think it was Dog Eat Dog. It was one of the Paul Schrader, Nicolas Cage. The first collaboration was also taken out of Paul Schrader's hand, changed, and Paul Schrader got the opportunity to do a second movie with him. I'm not sure which one was Dog Eat Dog, the first one or the second one, but I would like to get that opportunity too, because I felt like, and I'm glad that I could put out this version. It was hard won. I mean, I had to go to the DGA. There were all kinds of threats back and forth. I don't have the best resolution version of it, but at least you can see what the idea of the movie was, what it really was supposed to be. And it's quite a bit different than the version that they, as my father used to say, that movie wasn't released, it escaped, and that's what happened to that movie. So I'm happy that I have a place to sort of show that movie and get people to check it out and look at it, because it's a very, very different experience.
All right, Larry, your kids, Sophie, Pearl, Zelda, and Francesco.
Yes.
Great fans of Seinfeld? Those four? Is the youth still watching the show?
My kids. Here's the line that explains my kids' relationship to me in terms of my professional life.
Yeah.
One time I was trying to be funny at home. This was during my first marriage, and the kids were small still. My kids are way grown up now. I'm a grandfather. They were small, and they were all wise asses, and little wits. And I was trying to do something funny, something goofy, like a singing in a funny way or something. And my daughter Sophie, who's the oldest, said, "It's amazing that everything we have is because people think you're funny." And so that's. They didn't really take any of it seriously at all. They're not impressed. You know what I mean? I mean, they are now as adults. They can look at it and go, "Wow, you've done great work. We're really proud of you." We're very close, and it's very sweet, actually. But in terms of like watching Seinfeld, I don't ask them what their watching habits are, what their viewing habits are. I think they have seen it. We've talked about it here and there. They've come to all the premieres of my movies. They're fans, but I don't put any of that pressure on them at all, so they are who they are, and they're into what they're into. And for them, it's a different relationship to Seinfeld, as I would imagine it is for Larry's kids or Jerry's kids. It's a slightly different relationship than I think the average young person today, who still gets into it on that kind of, fanatical level.
Was Dylan a Seinfeld fan?
I don't think Dylan was even aware that Seinfeld existed. When I asked him to direct the movie, which was like one of the hardest things I ever had to do,
right.
He just went, "Okay." That's all he said. I mean, that was like, it wound up being the easiest gig I ever got. But I mean, it took me weeks to build up the courage to ask him to let me direct the movie.
Well,
So
Larry,
he was about that.
Larry, there's a million things we could keep talking about. In this book.
This is incredible. We
want to be respectful of your time, and I know you're working on some new things. Hopefully, I don't know how much you can share, but maybe when that comes back, you can come back and we could keep talking. But this has been great.
Listen, man, I really enjoyed it. You guys are great. It was a nice freewheeling conversation that covered a lot of ground, and I'd be happy to come back and do it again. Let's definitely do it again at some point.
Thank you so much, Larry.
Love the book.
Okay, man. Great to meet you both. Talk to you very soon.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.